Aloha and welcome to this module on interactive development environments. I think that this is one of the most fundamental things or technologies for software engineering. It's kind of like if you're a tennis player, your IDE is your tennis racket. If you're a paddler, it's your paddle. If you're a card player, it's your cards, maybe. I don't know. Anyway, super important, and I hope this semester that you'll learn to love interactive development environments, and no matter what language you use, you'll demand to use an IDE. It might be Eclipse, it might be some other IDE, but it's definitely going to be an IDE. So let's start off by saying what is an interactive development environment. Basically, it's a tool that has the following properties. You must have language-aware editing, so it should understand the syntax and in some cases the semantics of the language that you're using to write your program in. It should have the ability to define a project or a collection of files which is going to work together to build your system. It should have a compiler integrated into the environment so that you get compilation kind of in the background. And it's definitely got to have some kind of debugging capability so that you can step through code and see what the values of variables are and so forth. There's a lot of other things that IDEs can have that are kind of less essential. They might have wizards for constructing certain kinds of multi-file or multi-part components. It could have tools for diagramming like UML. It could have task analysis. It could have integrated configuration management, refactoring, which is almost should be a required property of every IDE. That's so critical. And Eclipse has all these other common features, some of which we'll use, some of which we won't. So given that definition, there's a bunch of tools that would qualify as being an IDE, including Emacs, Eclipse, IDEA, JBuilder, Visual Studio, NetBeans, Xcode, etc., etc. And then there's some editors that aren't IDEs, like Word or Notepad or TextPad. I claim that VI is not an IDE, although some people might dispute that, but they're wrong. It's not an IDE. Okay, so sometimes I see people, particularly younger, more kind of junior developers, they still are kind of clinging to using Notepad or TextPad for their development, and I want to help you guys get to the point where you would never even think of using Notepad to do programming. Notepad is fine if you're going to edit a file that contains, some path definitions or something like that. I mean, an IDE isn't going to really help you that much in that kind of environment. But to use a text editor, a primitive text editor for the purposes of developing source code, that's just crazy. That's crazy stuff. Okay, so I will accept the fact that using an IDE, it's complicated. There is a learning curve. There's a lot of different little buttons and windows and panes and things you have to kind of learn about in order to use an IDE. And it may take 5 or 10 seconds to load the first time you bring it up. And I've noticed today from the worksheets that you guys filled in that some of you, it's taking, check this out, 60 seconds to bring up Eclipse. Okay, so that is not acceptable. If it's taking you any more than 10 seconds for Eclipse, it should be taking about 5 to 6 seconds. Okay, if it takes any more than 10 seconds for Eclipse to come up in your environment, you've got something wrong with your environment. You need to figure it out and fix it. I've given you a big hint about what it might be in the notes. There's some other things that might be also a problem, but you definitely want to make sure the startup time is under a dozen seconds, under 10 seconds really is completely reasonable. Okay, so the reason why you want to use an IDE is because you're going to be more productive. Okay, it's going to help you understand large systems faster than you'd be able to without one. It's going to enable you to debug your code faster than if you didn't use one. And it's going to be able to gain insight and make improvements to systems much faster than if you didn't have it. And I tell you, in this class, being able to work fast and effectively is the key to success. Okay? If you're skilled with using an IDE, you might be done, in 60% of the time that it would take you to be done if you're using an inferior tool. Okay? And essentially all of the things that I'm trying to present to you this semester are things that while you're learning them, you feel like things are slowing down. Okay, I'm going to grant that when you're first starting out with Eclipse and you're making little changes and you don't understand what's happening, you're spending a lot of time kind of trying to figure out, like, what the heck is Eclipse doing right now, and how do I get from here to there, and so on and so forth. Okay, this is your semester to embrace the learning curve. Okay, because by the end of this semester, if you've embraced the learning curve at the beginning of the semester, you're going to be able to accomplish tasks at the end of the semester and the assignments that I'm going to be giving you at the end of the semester that will be just miserably long and complicated and difficult if you don't use the tools, if you haven't achieved mastery of the tools and if you don't employ them. Okay? So, just suspend your disbelief. That's one of my favorite phrases for this class. Suspend your disbelief. Fight through the learning curve, or better yet, don't fight it, just embrace it. Spend some time in these environments. Get good at using them, and your investment will pay off multiple times. Okay? There's a more pragmatic reason why you should use an IDE, and that's because it helps you in the job market. Okay? So, one recruiter told me that the first thing they ask potential recruits is what kind of editor you like to use when writing software, and if they say Notepad or WordPad, then that's it. That person's not going to be hired. They don't know it yet because the interview will continue, but they've just kind of demonstrated that they haven't achieved a certain level of sophistication that's important to that recruiter. So, to kind of sum it up, you've got things that are easy on the left, like tricycles and fingers and inflatable rafts, but on the right you have things that are more complicated, harder to learn, but enable you to do things you simply aren't able to do with the stuff on the left-hand side. So in Notepad, for example, if you tried to compile a file or in any kind of dumb editor, there's this lack of integration, lack of language awareness, which means that you're not going to see certain errors as quickly, and you have to go back and forth between a terminal window where you're compiling things and the editor window where you're fixing things, and it's a lot of kind of context switching. So with IDEs, the idea is that you do less context switching, which enables you to spend more time in the flow state, which is another important concept for this class and for software development in general, which is that you want to be in the flow state, and your tools can either help you get into that state or can fight you being in that state. Okay? So let's look at some of the things that IDEs have. They should support coding by enabling navigation, code completion, background compilation. They should support testing by enabling you to quickly set up unit tests, and they should support debugging through stepping and stepping through your code, and maybe even restarting your code at various breakpoints. Finally, an increasingly important or fundamental feature for me for IDEs is the support for refactoring. And that's because as a system evolves over time, you're going to find that the classes and the variables and the objects that you use in that system, their behavior and capabilities are going to evolve. And eventually what's going to happen is their behavior and capabilities will evolve to the point that the class or the package or the variable or the object, the name of it no longer accurately represents what its current function or capability is. Okay? So at that point, you've got a problem if you don't have an IDE. If you have an IDE, which has refactoring, then it's very simple. You just kind of right click on the name of the class or the package or the this or the that. You name it to a new name which more correctly represents its current behavior or functionality, and the IDE will go throughout your entire system and do all the renaming required to keep the system in a consistent state. Okay? If you don't have an IDE, you're going to be doing this searching and replacing kind of thing, and it'll take far, far longer. It's far, far more error prone, and it's far, far more mentally fatiguing, and so you don't do it. Okay? And if you don't do it, then your system is slowly dying. Okay? Because it's going to be harder to understand, harder to maintain, harder to read, harder for new people to kind of come into and get a sense for what's going on, because the names of your objects don't correctly reflect what it is they're actually doing. There's some kind of historical, their name is a product of the history of the system rather than the way it currently is. So refactoring is an extremely important capability for long-lived systems that are going to evolve, which any good system is going to be. So here's some screen dumps of Eclipse, and you can see that it has things like this. When there's a package that hasn't been imported, it'll tell you that it hasn't been imported, and it'll give you some suggestions about where you can get it from. Here's support within Eclipse to actually invoke a program, and you can, you can, in this case, it's running a particular test, but you can also have configurations that allow you to run the program, provide certain arguments, provide certain environment variables, and so on and so forth. Here's an example of the debugging system or the debugging configuration within Eclipse. So you can single step through code, you can see the values of variables at certain points in time, make changes, and so forth. Okay. Finally, here's an example of refactoring where we have a method whose name we want to change because it no longer maybe reflects what it actually does, and so we select the name and we bring up a little dialog box which we can type in the new name. It'll search through your code, change all the references to this name, to this method, to its new name. Okay, so here's just a bunch of things that are either things that you wouldn't do because it's too painful to do them, or you would like to do if it was super easy for you to do them. Okay, and there's a lot of things like that in development, where the more capabilities you can bring to your aid in a fast and efficient manner, the faster you can proceed. Okay, and so that's kind of the set of tools that I'm introducing you to this semester are expanding the palette. It's like the palette of colors that an artist has with which to paint a painting. So in general, kind of the more colors you have, the more options you have, and sometimes the more creative you can be. Okay, now later in the semester we'll be talking about build tools, and build tools have some similarities to IDE, so I kind of want to give you a sense for the similarities and differences. When I talk of IDEs like Eclipse and IDEA or Visual Studio or whatever, the intended support for the intended task that IDEs are designed for is the process of writing code and all the peripheral activities around that: compilation, testing, refactoring, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, and in a large project, or let's say in an open source community, you may find that you have people working on your project using different IDEs because they have personal preferences. Now in this class, of course, I'm demanding that all of you guys use the same IDE, and that's because you'll be spending a lot of time working together, and you'll find it's way easier to collaborate in a face-to-face setting and learn from each other if you're all using the same tool. In a more kind of standard open source software development environment, people use the IDE that they're most comfortable with and like the best, and so we need some way of doing compilation, testing, packaging, and so forth that doesn't force everybody in the project to use the same IDE. So even though, Eclipse may have support for, you can run JUnit tests from within the IDE, you wouldn't want to force everybody to use Eclipse on your project, or say, okay, well, if you're not using Eclipse, then you don't have to do any testing. That would be ridiculous. So build tools are a way of providing platform independent and ID independent approaches to doing your kind of fundamental build operations, which involves compiling the system, running the tests, packaging it up for distribution, running certain quality assurance tools, and so forth. And that's really nice because it means that now you can have a broader community of people working on your project. They don't all have to be using the same IDE. They don't all have to be using the same platform. And your build tools are the glue that kind of holds all of these people together and enables them to see and kind of have a standardized workflow in some sense. Okay, so we're using Eclipse 3.7. Reasons for this: it's a good IDE. It's not necessarily the very best IDE. Again, I don't know that it's even my favorite, but it's a good one. It's certainly reasonable. It runs on all the platforms that we need it to run on. It provides some nice infrastructure for some of our other tools. And as I said before, it's as a standard, it's very reasonable for the next 4 months. You can use it, and who knows, someday there'll be some job environment where they'll want you to use Eclipse, and if you've used it for 4 months, even if you go on to another tool afterwards, you'll be able to come up to speed in it quickly. So what we're going to do to get comfortable with Eclipse is a variety of programs. You're going to do FizzBuzz, and I have another little project I'm thinking about for you to fiddle around with, and then we're going to start using the Robocode environment next week, and you'll be using Eclipse to do your development in. So for the next month or so, you'll be doing some fun programming that is essentially a medium for you to get familiar with all the different tools that we'll be creating. All right, thanks a lot, and see you soon.